started the series 2 weeks ago, and one of the points that Vanessa made was about the homogeneity of the imaginaries that envision different forms of climate urbanism. And in a way, what I want to do in this talk is to sort of open up some of the imaginaries that are being developed and the techniques and technologies that are associated with them in the domain of weather modulation. So this particular talk, I've been very interested in work over the last couple of years around the construction of climate control in enclosed spaces, but I've also been quite intrigued to see the transmutation of techniques used indoors to the outdoor domain. And actually, what I want to do in this particular lecture is problematize urban weather. This is something I think everyone who's listening will have talked about today. Apparently, we all talk about the weather on a regular basis. It's one of the most searched terms on the internet. But actually, I want to argue that in urban studies, there's a tendency to sort of naturalize weather and to see it as a background. So I'm quite interested in this sort of unpacking this interrelationship between weather and climate. So conventionally, particularly in climate science, there's been a distinction made between climate, which is about long-term timescales of several decades. It's measured indirectly. It's chronological. It's about the use of modernity and the development of climate sciences. Represents a form of hard knowledge, whereas the weather is about short-term timescales of minutes, hours, and days. It's perceived indirectly. It's ephemeral, and it's the sort of it's the context that actually provides over the longer term the data through which we understand climate. And what I want to argue in this paper is that I think in urban studies and in climate urbanism, we need to start engaging more seriously with the weather and the short term and the microspatial experience of weather. And I want to do that through the lens of heat. I particularly want to use, I can't deal with every aspect of urban weather, so I want to utilize heat as a flux, as a medium through which we can begin to think about the agency of weather and the ways in which I want to argue and demonstrate to you a huge degree of experimentation in trying to mobilize responses to modulate our relationship between urban life and heat. And just to start that, I want to give you a few examples of the way over the summer, the last few months, heat has become very, very visible. So if you and in terms of thinking about heat, I want you to try to think about heat as a sort of energy flow. So heat moves in through atmospheric, through buildings and materials, through bodies, human bodies and non-human bodies. Try to imagine heat as a sort of as a metabolic flow that interrelates between the human, non-human, the technical forms of life. And this particular example is from Moscow, where overheating in August was actually melting the road surface. And in order to retain the use of the road surface, the municipality mobilized trucks that would to spray water onto the roads to enable their continued use. And I think this is sort of evocative of the interrelationships between climate and weather, and the ways in which that dichotomous way of seeing the interrelationship is perhaps more porous and problematic. The next example is from the north of America, where there was a historic heat dome that was blocked. It was blocked by high pressure unprecedented. Statistically speaking, it would be a once in a 1,000-year event, sat over the northwest of the USA, producing record temperatures in cities in both Canada and the US. And this mega of a citizen standing in front of a misting station to try to cool down. This can cool down the temperature by 5 to 7 degrees centigrade. So these sort of weather megastructures become intimately related with responses in the urban context. Next example. There was a headline in August, Sydney orders white roofs and a tree in every garden to tackle climate change. These sorts of mega structures also affect Western Sydney, where heating from the Pacific Ocean sort of these latest climate responses. And you can see the way in which the retrofitting of roofs, they're painting with reflective paint, white paints, and the trees become mobilized in an attempt to deal with the heat caused by these mega structures. Now, I think what's important is that we need to, as urbanists, I think we need to find a way of engaging more seriously with weather. I think weather, the agency of weather, more turbulent weather, is going to be critical in shaping both shaping questions about reproduction, the habitability of urban spaces, health, economy, and in all sorts of ways. And I think we need to sort of find a way. It's not to argue that weather's not been a concern at all of urban studies, but actually I think there is some particular challenges of how we now try to understand the sort of foregrounding of weather and the way that it shapes the very context, some have called it the operating space, in which we live. And I think there's three concepts from outside urban studies that are really quite helpful in sort of starting to make some of this move. And also urban studies offers some ways of also thinking through more carefully how these pressures are understood and constituted. So the first concept is from climate science, which talks about a new climate regime. And the table on the bottom left is based on actual data and analysing summer temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. The white line is between 1951 and 1980 of normal temperature range, and the red is the actual summer temperatures between 2004 and 2014. And you can see this shift in the curve from left to right, and the language that's trying to be developed here about previous climate, normal climate, new climate, and this has very particular sorts of consequences. It increases the frequency of heat waves, the intensity in terms of how extreme they are, and the duration. It makes heat waves longer. And actually, urban cities themselves contribute to this climate regime, because anthropogenic heat that's produced by buildings, cars, the heat that's reflected from concrete or retained by concrete, contributes quite significantly to this new climate regime. And this climate regime has powerful effects in how it reshapes the context in which urban life takes place. So there's been a significant expansion in terms of urban networks concerned around heat. The Cool Cities Global Alliance, the C40 network has been very active in heat, who are starting to try to understand some of the implications of these changes. By 2050, more than nearly 1,000 cities will experience average summertime temperature highs of 35 degrees centigrade. The urban population exposed to these temperatures might be 1.6 billion by 2050. Heat is already the major climate-related cause of illness and deaths. The 2003 heat wave in Europe led to 70,000 deaths. Heat does put pressure on emergency and health services, but also the ability to maintain infrastructure services. Very good evidence that this leads to dramatic loss in productivity, and very good empirical evidence of that. And the claim is that heat action plans and early warning systems, as well as increasing blue and green infrastructure, can help increase urban resilience. And just to give you some sense of the scale and scope of this problem, in some of the work that was sponsored by the C40, these are the cities with urban populations at risk of 3 months average maximum summer temperature of 35 degrees centigrade, and that's potentially life-threatening. And you can see this swathe of cities through North, South America, North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, the Middle East, Asia, China, that of a context in which life will be extremely difficult. And if you include those urban areas of where it's less than 3 months, there's a wider swathe of urban contexts that are seriously affected by these increased temperatures. And it's not just human life that's affected, it's also non-human life and the technologies that we take for granted in the everyday. So in the top left here, these are payment systems for petrol pumps that need, in the southern US, that need an additional air conditioning unit to get these technologies to their specified working temperatures. So this new climate regime alters the standards and assumptions that have underpinned the design of technologies. Also, the productivity, particularly of dairy cows, drops dramatically in extreme summer temperatures. So there's now active cooling and shading of dairy cattle to maintain optimum productivity. This seriously affects nature and wildlife. These are bats in Western Sydney. There's implications for pets and working dogs, and businesses now in the US offering particular cooling systems for the police, pet owners, so their dogs can live outside during the summer months. And rather disturbingly, the efficiency of air conditioning systems to cool the indoors drops dramatically in high temperatures and high humidity, and cooling systems are now being installed to enable air conditioning systems to work effectively and efficiently in heat extremes. This is a systemic problem. Now, the second concept I want to mobilize from outside urban studies is the concept of the weather world. This was a concept developed by the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who was really interested in trying to think about the way in which social sciences in general tended to emphasize the solid forms of the landscape, but then neglected the fluxes of the medium in which they immersed. In a word, they have shut out the weather. And I think this work's particularly interesting because urban studies has actually spent a lot of time trying to understand the enclosure, the importance of enclosure, the importance of indoor environments to enable the dramatic spread of urbanization and suburbanization in climates that would be normally too hostile to support urban life. And the way that it's done that in highly standardized indoor environments of 20 to 22 degrees centigrade and 60% humidity, which have enabled large floor plates, glass walls, and the interior climate control has played this really quite specific role in enabling a particular form of urbanization, but in a form of urbanization where the energy and infrastructural inputs have also contributed significantly to global carbon emissions. But what's interesting about Tim Ingold's work is he wants us to think about the weather world. He wants us to think about how we might contextualize the exterior as a medium, as a flux, which has multiple material and other sorts of social effects, and the diversity, the difference, the agency and the flows of the weather world in terms of what it can enable and also what it can delimit. And I think this concept is quite useful in terms of orientating us. It's not that we need to ignore the outside, the indoors, but I think this question of weather might signal a turn in which we try to begin to think about how the urban weather world is constituted and how changing weather itself enables and delimits different forms of life. Then the third concept I'd like to mobilize is one developed by two feminist scholars, this concept of weathering. And I think this speaks to a quite long-standing set of concerns within urban studies. And by weathering, they mean learning to live with changing conditions of rainfall, drought, heat, and thaw and storm that constitute the weather world as never separable from the total climate of social, political, cultural, economic existence of bodies. This includes anti-blackness, coloniality, misogyny, and the resourcing and thingification of other bodies. And I think this notion of weathering is quite helpful in helping us to think about the interrelationship between the material, the social, cultural, economic in place. And I think it speaks to a lot of existing work that's been undertaken in geography, urban studies, and public health that talks about the uneven experience of turbulent weather. And this is captured very nice in a piece by Alex Nading. Heat is both evenly distributed and patchy in terms of how it's actually experienced. Some bodies, not all, are deteriorating. And he argues, instead of teetering between extinction and survival, perhaps we humans are instead catching a glimpse of a new thermal necropolitics, mobilizing Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, in which heat kills not globally, but selectivity. So I think this concept of weathering is actually really helpful for us in thinking through the uneven effects of weather turbulence. Now, I now want to make three propositions for what I think is happening, because I think what I want to argue is that there is the mobilization of expertise, techniques, technologies around the weather that hasn't necessarily been a focus for urban studies, but I think it's something that we have to engage with quite seriously. And I want to make three propositions for what I think is happening. And in this first proposition, we're very familiar with the notion of urban mitigation, the concept of urban areas producing carbon emissions, so urban areas need to think about carbon reduction. We're very familiar with the concept of urban adaptation. How is critical infrastructure redesigned to meet expectations of changing sea level rise? I wanted to talk about a third feedback loop, and this is inspired by the work of Bruce Brown, Simon Davudi, and Stephanie Wakefield around urban resilience. I think the way in which turbulent weather is being thought about, it's about an attempt to maintain a safe operating space and to develop a capacity to live with weather turbulence whilst minimizing the impact on urban life. And I think it's almost, and I think that's sort of seeing weather turbulence as a security, as a economic challenge to the maintenance of life infrastructure and urban economies can help us start to understand this notion of what I want to call urban thermal modulation. Why is the problematic of heat being engaged with by a very diverse set of social interests? It's about this notion of how to live with the changing nature of the changing climate. Now, critical to that is the way in which questions around heat are being subject to particular sorts and forms of interventions. And I want to develop this proposition of something I've called the urbanization of thermal modulation. And this draws a little bit from some of the thinking in architectural history around the role of heat in the colonial period. Now, in the contemporary period, I want to argue that the urbanisation of thermal modulation is a set of interventions that are designed to produce a change in the use of how do we use the outside, when do we use it, who uses it, and the intensity, so how hot is it outside, of the outdoor milieu over a particular area, sometimes at the level of a patio or a business, sometimes over whole districts or sub-areas, or even in some imaginaries across the metropolitan, across the whole metropolitan scale, to maintain a safe operating space during overheating. And this is about reshaping the use of outdoor space and who uses it in heat extremes, and new techniques of thermal, atmospheric, terrestrial re-engineering that can enable a safe operating space for life or comfort in thermal extremes. And my argument is that thermal modulation is emerging through a bricolage. And you can find it, so it draws upon an existing very diverse set of knowledge, practices and technologies that's already active in urban meteorology, interior climate control, disaster emergency planning, digital technologies, and it assembles these as a bricolage of responses that I think are all about trying to improve the climate, the weather, improve the atmospheric milieu of urban areas at this boundary between the terrestrial and atmospheric domains. And I want to talk a little bit about the evidence to support this contention that there is the emergence of this sort of bricolage of responses that can somehow stitch together canopies and landscaping, trees, emergent infrastructure systems, air conditioning, trying to modify the flow of air through urban areas, use of vegetation and water features. And this mode of this bricolage, I think, is being brought together in sort of three sets of domains that represent particular modes of engaging with turbulent weather. And the first one of these is about the nature of the problematic and whether or not this is a emergency, a short-term emergency that happens relatively infrequently, or whether this is an unfolding chronic sort of slow disaster. And it's quite interesting when you look at the ways in which expertise has been mobilized around heat extremes and heat waves. It's primarily seen as a public health emergency, actually. And so it mobilizes expertise in public health, hospitals, emergency response, often involving local authorities and public health agencies. And it prioritizes a particular way of seeing the issue of excessive heat. Excessive heat can be prepared for by identifying vulnerable populations who have limited ability to adapt. They might not have air conditioning, and they might not have access to shading. They may have illnesses. There's different levels of susceptibility. And the dominant way of responding to heat emergencies is through the development of protocols, plans, employment of heat officers, cooling shelters that are very much around protecting, anticipating and protecting vulnerable populations and mobilizing resources in advance to do that, to minimize the temporality of the emergency. And this is a very powerful, and some elements of this are powerfully automated through digital technologies and the provision of particular sorts of cooling shelters and services. And obviously it makes an awful lot of sense to try to protect those people who will be made seriously ill or die. But interestingly, a lot of that public health community are concerned about the narrowness of the response, partly because it doesn't deal with the underlying problematic about the structural issues that lead to vulnerability, differential levels of vulnerability, but in particular because this isn't just a series of short-term emergencies, this is also a chronic disaster. This table on the this diagram on the bottom right here, these are cities that suffer from a minimum of 3 months of these temperatures over 30, in this case Delhi, over 30 degrees, and this shows you the nighttime and the daytime temperatures. In this set of urban contexts, this is not just a short-term emergency. This lasts for a long period of time, and in fact, in a number of these contexts, it's more than 3 months. It's more like 5 months that you have these very high, potentially life-threatening temperatures. And this is in 2018, not the temperatures that are expected in 10 or 20 years' time. So there's a disjuncture between how the problematic is seen and the nature of the existing pressures and how those pressures are likely to intensify in the future. And you can start to see how these sorts of issues are stimulating all sorts of thinking. So there's been work done, this is around Phoenix, Arizona. There's a heat relief network was set up in 2019 following the death of nearly 200 homeless people, 2/3 of whom were outside, and they think excessive temperatures played a role in their death. And this is leading to work thinking about where's Phoenix heading in terms of future temperature rises, and it will be very similar, they think, to the climate in Kuwait by the end of the century. And it's already leading to sort of adaptations. A lot of construction work in the summer takes place at night because materials won't cure properly. Regional and municipal parks are now open during the nighttime period because it's more comfortable for hikers to be able to enjoy the outdoors at nighttime. The Heat Relief Network distribute these booties and shoes to the homeless to ensure that they don't burn themselves. And they also have developed this cooled bus shelter because the transit system is very difficult to use during these extreme heat events. And you start to see that this is not just an emergency, it is an emergency, but it's the normalization of emergency. This is a systematic problem in the urban domain. The other example, the city of Jacobabad in Pakistan, where there was a really a very nice, I think, important bit of journalism done in Time magazine in 2019, looking at how do people survive in an environment that reaches 51 degrees and does so and reaches these high temperatures for months at a time. And there was some discussion about whether this was the hottest inhabited place in the world at the time, which it might not have been, but it apparently is now. And in reading about this, it was really intriguing. Pakistan must prioritize adequately finance extreme heat resilience and mitigation if it is to achieve its regional geoeconomic ambitions. And a connection's being made between these mega heat waves and their increased frequency, intensity, and duration, and Pakistan's wider economic and geopolitical ambitions, and the need that places for a more systemic response in its urban context. Now, what that systemic response, so if this is a slow disaster, the systemic response, and I don't expect you to read this, but this is to just give you a flavor of some of the nature-based materials, technologies, water features that are envisioned to try to cool down the urban environment, and the highly systemic, profound nature of those changes, and just the degree of capacity and financing and resourcing that we've required to mobilize trees, photovoltaic panels, cool materials with high reflexivity, thermochromic materials that take heat out of the environment. This isn't just about an emergency response, it was going to require systematic change. Now, while whether heat is being problematized in the domain of public health, there's also something really interesting happening in parallel with that in urban meteorology and weather forecasting more widely. Now, the technoscience of meteorology traditionally hasn't actually been that concerned with urban areas, because urban areas have really been contained within large-scale regional forecasting. And I think over the last 2 decades, there's a process that I think it's possible to argue represents almost the urbanization of meteorology, or the urbanization of weather forecasting. There's been a massive expansion in terms of techniques, technologies, and institutional engagement between meteorological organizations and the urban context. And in fact, if you search urban studies and weather, you bring up lots of references to the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, who've been central to these sets of changes. And what this is about, critically what this is about, is the development of capacity to be able to understand microspatial variations in weather. So traditionally, weather forecasting has happened over large scales. These techniques enable them to forecast weather in 250 to 50 meter squared blocks and 15 minutes to 2-hour forecasts. So this is about a different type of weather forecasting. In fact, they call it nowcasting because of these very short-term and microspatial abilities that they now have. And you can see that in this mapping of heat temperatures that gives you a sense of their ability to integrate different types of satellite data, information from vehicles. Car vehicles apparently measure temperature, and all sorts of devices. And that's part of this, something that is sort of called smart weather, the way in which it's now possible to buy high quality and relatively cheap domestic weather stations and apps that go with them. Specialist apps have been developed, Aerator and Extrema. These were developed by research programs that enable people to better understand their vulnerability to heat. So these apps they can put in information about themselves, any health problems they have, and the apps claim to be able to provide very accurate information about their ability to use the outdoor environment and to give warnings and to make suggestions about how they use the outdoors during heat extremes, whether you go outdoors or not, what routes you might want to use, how long you want to be outside. Heat data's increasingly being crowdsourced, and there's this sort of open weather movement. So there's a lot happening in the sort of sensing and monitoring and the turning of that sort of data into intelligence. The World Meteorological Organization has been really uber active in this area around this notion of integrated service platforms. So it's not even called weather forecasting any longer. And what they've been doing is working with a group of 100 cities to try to develop this notion of using nowcasting, these very short-term predictive capacities. And rather than providing weather forecasts, they're trying to provide real-time management, disaster risk reduction, or longer-term climate services. So the claim is that it becomes possible not to say it's going to be hot for the next 3 days, but to be able to say it's going to be hot in these particular places, these particular populations are at risk, you need to mobilize resources and open cooling shelters, and you need capacity and staff to do that. So there a huge degree of investment's been made around the creation of, in a sense, the sort of weather as a service. And then there's a set of commercial intelligent weather products that are being developed. So there's significant growing domains in terms of digital financing is around weather and weather intelligence, and the development of these sorts of products customized for particular sectors, obviously some that are very obvious, like farming, but also logistics, retail, whole set of sectors where their economic performance is interrelated with meteorological conditions. Now, I think this is it's really quite significant, because when you start to look, these weather services operate at different timescales and at different spatial scales as well. While conventional climate services are dealing in months, seasons, annual, decades, and centuries, this is about trying to constitute a different form of ways of knowing and forms of prediction that enable highly customized site-specific forecasts that are designed to shape the way in which businesses operate and how space and infrastructure is utilized. And just to give you another example from tomorrow.io, they develop a weather intelligence product, which they claim is designed for about 20 or 30 different sectors, including the optimization of city planning and resource management to keep residents safe and reduce weather-related risks. And this is about the ways in which these sort of weather intelligence platforms claim they can develop rules and protocols to deal with different types of weather events, automate decision making so that the resources are mobilized and put in the right places at the right times to reduce the operational impact or to plan to work around. And this in a sense these are the techniques and the ways of knowing weather that are claimed to be able to work with weather-related turbulence while minimizing costs and maintaining operational efficiencies of business and infrastructures. And the third area where I think this form of thermal modulation is emerging is the actual creation of perfect weather. So you might want to change the way in which the city and infrastructure is used. You might want energy companies and people to behave in different types of ways. So you can modulate the use of the urban context. But the other option related to that is that you might actually want to modify the intensity of heat extremes. I mean, you might want to actually intervene. And you can obviously you can do that through passive measures and shading. But there is also highly active measures. So PCS is personal cooling systems. So a particular concern for utilities, security services, the military, is how do they ensure that their workers can operate outside in thermal extremes that are damaging to the human body. And there's been a massive expansion in personal cooling systems, and these are active systems that cool the body to enable people to operate outside for 3 or 4 hours at a time, battery-powered cooling units. And these are sort of systems that might have originally been utilized in aircraft and submarines, but are now being utilized in outdoor environments for utility workers, security workers. And these are not just highly specialized for those sorts of domains. Sony now make a cooling system that you put down the back of your shirt to cool you in your commute to work. And there's also Panasonic, Sony are building these sorts of devices to individual personal cooling devices. There's also the emergence of devices that operate outside in the urban context. The first one here, Habitat, is a Singapore company that claims to build high efficiency outdoor cooling systems. They use them at Singapore Zoo for when the queues get large outside. They use them gone by the bay. They use them on their national Singapore Day when there's large numbers of people outside. They use them at bus stops. They've had built open bus stops that cool down transit users. These systems are also used in the Middle East. These two examples come from the Middle East. Actual air conditioning units that are taken outdoors, misting systems with fans, and then the infamous Qatar air-conditioned football stadium. There's also debates about whether it's possible to cool the whole urban domain. And there's some really interesting work that's been going on, rather than thinking about cooling in enclaves, to think about the possibility of creating a cooled commons that tries to think more systematically about the integration across different types of urban spaces, particularly in the public domain, high trafficked spaces, the public domain around stations, bus stops, retail areas, to try to create, is it possible, and there's work going on that's seriously asking, is it possible to cool the urban domain at scale, which might then keep a downward pressure on demand for indoor cooling? And the reason that this sort of active socio-technical forms of intervention are developing is because even if you use shading, reflective materials, green and nature-based infrastructures, you still can't reduce, you could probably only reduce urban temperatures by about 3.5 degrees. There's a huge amount of work that's gone on in sort of environmental services, urban meteorology, to look at the performance of these sorts of systems. And the conclusion that's being reached in that sector is that there's a profound need to develop advanced mitigation technologies and active cooling techniques. These look like proto-infrastructures. And here's one of the US companies, Mist Cooling, and it's a graphic that, I know this looks like a farmstead, and it probably is, but gives you some sense of the ways in the multiple ways in which cooling is being thought about here. So fan-based mist cooling for children's play area, mosquito control systems, odor control systems, livestock misting systems for your dairy cows, patio cooling, greenhouse humidification, but it also includes cooling the roof. And roof cooling actually is remarkably effective in reducing interior energy demand for air conditioning. And their vision also includes air-conditioned pre-cooling to improve the operational efficiencies of interior cooling, pool cooler, tent mister. This sort of, there's a systemic sense of how these systems will be used. And I could have shown you a number of different national contexts, but China is one of the most interesting contexts. I want to thank Bai Chan for helping me with some of these images and contexts. China, large urban areas in China all have a weather modification capacity. And there's a national weather modification plan in which large city regions play a very active role, actually. This was mobilized around the Beijing Olympics. It's utilized on a regular basis. It's been written about quite interestingly in Geoforum in a number of articles. But there's also the emergence of these sorts of cooling systems. These are in Shanghai. This is in Shanghai, Tianzifang, which is an old area that in the summer months it struggles to compete with a large indoor shopping center. So they've been developed a very extensive misting system that enables them to attract tourists even in the summer months. A lot of experimentation with cooling bus shelters. These sorts of cannon systems are mobilized and used around central areas. I've been under them when they've been passing. It's a very nice cooling feeling. One of my interviewees described it as like being in a forest. And the misting is used to control dust. And there's the way in which it's been talked about, the mobilization of the machine sky. Now, just to try and sort of bring this into some sort of what's happening here. What's happening here? So I think the conventional and still important way of dealing with weather turbulence has been about preparedness for normal weather with unpredictable and infrequent emergencies, the development of protocols to return back to normal. Most of the mediation of weather has been enabled through technomediated, encapsulated interiors. Most, not all, I accept human activity takes place in these standardized all year round environments with these optimum thermal comfort benchmarks in buildings, very reliant on conventional weather forecasting, energy infrastructures, and a thermal comfort standard that largely does span the world, that's created these homogeneous encapsulated indoor landscapes with a very clear separation of indoor and outdoor. And what I want to argue is happening here is, and I'm struggling to think of the language to describe and conceptualize this, but it's almost a question around sort of a form of meteorological or weather security, where climate emergency and thermal threats have become normalized. The aim, in a sense, is to find ways of modulating the exterior outdoor milieu through atmospheric and digital interventions, through a bricolage of atmospheric and digital interventions. And the aim is to somehow render thermal turbulence manageable by stretching the potential for safe outdoor use for different types of bodies and activities, and for non-human life, materials and technologies. And this mobilizes smart weather, nowcasting, atmospheric engineering, outdoor cooling, climate services and forms of risk reduction. And I think this is leading to the sort of hybridization of interior-exterior space and the production of sort of thermally diverse landscapes, bubbles of landscapes outdoors. And just to give you a sense about what this world might look like, and whether or not this represents an attempt to constitute a thermal fix, I think there's three features of this that are important to understand. The way in which new standards for outdoor temperatures are now being developed. There's something called the Universal Thermal Climate Index. This is not as rigorous or strict or universally, it doesn't develop a very narrow singular band of temperatures. It tries to think about whether or not outdoor space can be used all year. Could it only be used seasonally? Could it be used short term? Or is it actually only able to be used for a very limited a time because it's too hostile? So they're trying to sort of actually try to think about the ways of developing forms of calculation where the urban domain is assessed, and in this case, the City of London. They're starting to work through whether or not, how comfortable different sorts of spaces are outdoors at different times of the year. And this is not just happening in London, it's happening in other places too. And in response to that, spaces are being planned and envisioned in different sorts of ways. Not only are there new standards, they're trying to think about a sort of a new lexicon to describe interior and outdoors. So interiors are conventionally fully conditioned. Outdoor zones are unconditioned. And this particular company, RWDI, has been trying to think about what it's called interior hybrid zones, a semi-conditioned zone. So this might have some natural ventilation. This particular example doesn't have cooling capacity, but it could do, they say in their work. This one has partial heating. Humidity fluctuates and is not controlled. And there's some potential for radiant heating, or they've experimented with heat from pavements. And they're sort of experimenting here with ways of extending climate control from indoors into the outdoor environment through the construction of these sorts of hybrid zones, which use combinations of the techniques I've talked about, passive, active, digital technologies to automate the use of cooling and shading technologies. And what this, how do you describe this sort of form of design? Cool spaces, spatial climatic devices, meteorological architecture. And here's an example of Jade Eco Park in Taiwan, which has, I think, 7 different climatic zones, which uses a range of different techniques, materials that feel cool to the touch. It pumps cool air out of tunnels from under the ground where the air is already cooler. It uses more active techniques of cooling. The ways in which, and there's multiple examples I could show you, the ways in which this sort of new hybrid architecture is emerging, which claims to be able to enable the continued use of outdoor space. Now, what's this about? I think it's stretching the ability to use outdoor space through these forms of active intervention. And this is an example that RWDI, who are one of the leading consultancies in this area, though there is others. Although we can't control the seasons, it's possible to more than double the number of comfortable daylight hours each year for key spaces. And this space actually was Sidewalk Labs, from about 30% to 74%. So on the left-hand side, they look at they monitored microspatially monitored weather, linked that to climate data from Toronto Pearson Airport to build up an understanding of when was it too cold or too hot to be outside in Sidewalk Labs in different parts of Sidewalk Lab. And they came up with a package. In this case, it was passive control measures, but actually it's less passive than it sounds. It was active forms of shading, very careful use of design and other sorts of materials as well. And the claim is that you can stretch the usability of outdoor space. And they argue in their work, if they use more active measures, the possibilities are really significantly enhanced. And it's really intriguing to see the ways in which new forms of calculation are now being made about this modification of outdoor space. Cool Fog, another one of another US company who's incredibly active in this area. They've done return on investment calculations for different sectors, and here's an example of a restaurant sector where they claim that people apparently want to sit outside in restaurants, and when it's too hot or too cold, in this case too hot, they've worked out the lost revenues that are associated with not being able to use a space because it's uncomfortable. And they're making the claims that these sorts of outdoor cooling systems will rapidly pay back, and all sorts of work is being undertaken and mobilized to justify this. So this particular company is very active in cooling outdoor spaces in schools. As the neuroscience has become more sophisticated, we've been able to peer into their cognitive processes and find ways in which to harness children's natural drive to learn and play. And they claim that actually the neuroscientific evidence shows that in extreme heat radically affects children's ability to learn. So creating creative outdoor cooling measures that utilize misting fans, poles, or systems allow them to connect with nature, play safely, and rest securely, offers a world where they can become our next generation of incredible leaders. And part of their logic is also questions of liability. A lot of private schools in the US are concerned about letting children outside in heat extremes because of liability issues, and that's another reason why these systems are being utilized. So, just coming towards an end here, then, one can start to see the way in which thermal modulation, which I think when I started talking to you sounds a little bit like science fiction. Actually, it doesn't. It's here. It's now, and it's being incorporated into all sorts of ways of thinking about how we prepare, how do we live with global overheating. And I think it speaks to a world of perfect weather, or sort of technically mediated perfect weather. I was really intrigued by these two images. Around the world in perfect weather, it's a 52-week-a-year dream trip, where the temperature is a consistent 21 to 24 degrees centigrade, which also mirrors indoor thermal standard temperatures. And I was wondering what this trip might look like in 2050, whether or not it would be possible, and to what extent the external climate of parts of these cities might actually be mediated through the sorts of systems and techniques that I've been outlining to you today. So there's this other Zillow measure of the number of pleasant days in the 25 most populous cities. A number of those cities, Phoenix figures in there as well, Austin, Fort Worth, in the southern part of the USA, are active areas where these sort of mediated systems of weather modulation are extremely active. So does this speak to a world in which actually we need to start thinking of the ways in which the livability and habitability and comfort is modulated through these forms, emerging forms of intervention? And so just to conclude, why does all this matter? Why does all this matter? Well, I think something's happening here that I'm partially struggling to understand. It's not the elimination of weather turbulence, but instead this is a claim about the modulation of their dynamics, about the use of space, the use of cities infrastructure, and the modulation of the actual material nature of the atmosphere, and in particular sorts of microclimates, and maybe a bit more at a bigger scale. And this is, I think, is about developing new ways of trying to live with the climate crisis. And the urban milieu becomes subject to new, some of them passive, nature-based, but also active technological modes of management, where new capacities are being introduced and experimented with. And the claim is the relationship between the city and planetary overheating can be modulated to create a safe operating space that minimizes the disruption and costs to urban life. And I think what's interesting about this is it superimposes an uneven patchwork of technically mediated microclimates over existing already uneven territorial and atmospheric milieu that sort of seem to be claiming that they can atmospherically or meteorologically disconnect from the meteorological commons. And my sense is that we as urbanists need to engage with this emerging shift, and that we need to perhaps enlarge our conception of climate urbanism to understand the way in which weather is now becoming subject to these new modes of technically mediated management. And on that point, I'll end. Thank you very much.